All right, so we're moving on then to lecture 4, the first 3 lectures having been introductory. And it's really in lecture 4, which is given in Oslo on October 5th of 1913, that he begins his narrative of the fifth gospel, his own gospel. He doesn't give the background, though. He must have given it elsewhere in another lecture, because he already sort of knows or presupposes that the audience knows what he means by his conception here of 2 different Jesus children. The one is descended from the Solomonic line. David has had these 2 children, one Solomon, and the Matthew Gospel. Matthew and Luke do not agree in the infancy narratives that they give of Jesus. They're 2 totally different narratives. In the Matthew narrative, we have the Annunciation to Joseph, whereas in the Luke narrative, we have the Annunciation to Mary. And it's in the Matthew narrative that we have the Magi, who have gone looking basically for the reincarnation of their master Zarathustra. So they've gone looking for it, which is why they have followed the star of Bethlehem. In the Luke Gospel, we have the presentation of the Christ child to these shepherds, but they're not the Magi, according to Steiner. So you have these 2 irreconcilable narratives, and what's even more irreconcilable are the 2 genealogies. In the one case, the boy who is descended from the Solomonic line, that's the kingly line. And in the other case, we have the boy who is descended from Solomon's priestly brother Nathan. So Steiner refers to them as the Solomon Jesus boy and the Nathan Jesus boy. The Nathan Jesus boy's ego has never before incarnated on the earth before. So he's untouched. So he has no karma. And so he's untouched. This is like Steiner's version of saying that he's untouched by original sin. And his actions on the earth generate no karma either. So he's untouched by original sin, which with the incarnation of Christ, Christ is untouched by original sin because his mother had an immaculate conception. And also Augustine had said that original sin was transmitted through semen, which is an idea that he had inherited from having been one of the Manichaeans. Augustine started out as a Manichaean, which he renounced when he converted to becoming a Christian. But because Mary was gave birth to Christ as a virgin, then he's unstained by original sin. So Steiner's version of this is to say that the Nathan Jesus boy did not have any karma and was therefore untouched by karma. That's his sort of Steiner's version of the myth of original sin. And anyhow, so this Nathan boy was a very warm, loving child, and would generally have been regarded as kind of backward, as what we might say of today of an autistic child, let's say. He was just very backward, not particularly intellectually gifted or developed. But he had inherited, according to Steiner, the astral body of the Buddha. By the principle of spiritual economy, which we've already seen in previous lectures, whereby an individual who has perfected their etheric bodies or their astral bodies, they're saved. They don't disintegrate in Kamaloka. They can be transmitted to other individuals. And so the Nathan boy had inherited the astral body of the Buddha, whereas the boy who was descended from Solomon, and these have 2 different sets of parents, was descended from Solomon, had inherited the ego of Zarathustra. And this is why the Magi have gone in the Matthew narrative looking for him. They're looking for, like Tibetan Buddhist monks, looking for the reincarnation of their Lama, their master. And so as it happens, Steiner opens the chapter talking about how in Luke, we get the narrative of at the age of 12, which note is a Jupiter return. That's 12 years for Jupiter to go around the sun. All of a sudden, the parents take the kid to Passover, and after the feast is over, they've lost him. They wonder where he is, and they wander to the temple, and they find him in the temple teaching the priests in the temple, teaching them, and they're absolutely surprised because hitherto, up to this point, their Nathan boy here has been regarded as kind of backward and very slow. And all of a sudden he's spouting all this doctrine as though he has been studying the scriptures and so forth. Whereas Steiner says what has happened is that the Solomon boy has died at this point, and his Zarathustra ego has transmigrated into the ego of the Nathan boy, who now has the astral body of the Buddha and the ego of Zarathustra, which is why he is suddenly very erudite. So they're surprised by this. So this is the background that Steiner opens this chapter with, presupposing that you know. He doesn't explain this differentiation. Later on in the narrative he will. But this is, so we've got this boy, And then the father of the Solomon child has died, whereas the mother of the Nathan child has died, and he had been raised a loner. So the father goes to live with the mother of the Solomon boy, who had a large family, 7 siblings, 4 brothers and 3 sisters. And so the two families combine in this way. And this is Steiner's way of reconciling the differences between the two infancy narratives. I doubt that this is actually what happened, but it's clever and ingenious nonetheless, and it's all about myth making anyhow. So that's the level that it should be appreciated on. He's inventing his own mythology of the life of Christ, and so he starts talking about what happens then is that the Nathan Jesus, who's the only one left now, has a tough road ahead of him, and he ends up leaving home and wandering through Palestine from about the age of 14 or so to 18, wanders through Palestine, and as a child he had noticed already that there had been a diminution of the prophets speaking with a voice called the Bath Call, which means daughter, Bath, Call, voice. It's basically the Hebrew equivalent of the Greek Sophia. It was later imported into the Hebrew tradition. The Bath Call has no longer been speaking through the prophets, and he's noticed the diminution of the voice of her, and it has gotten him rather depressed. So he's gone on this spiritual pilgrimage where he's wandering all through Palestine, and at one point, Steiner says, somewhere around the age of 18, 19, 20, something like that, maybe 20-ish, he encounters this group of pagans who are worshipers, and they see him, and for some reason they immediately think that he is the priest who has been sent to them to instruct them. So they put him in the role of priest of their ceremonies, which he reluctantly accepts. But then he has this out-of-body experience where his soul leaves his body and goes to the sun, and they think he's dead. They're terrified, these worshipers. And he goes to the sun where he can commune with the Bath Call and hear the voice of the Bath Call. And he also realizes in this clairvoyant vision, which I think is, Steiner calls it a clairvoyant vision, but I think it's an out-of-body experience, where he realizes that demons have infected these people, have gotten into their astral bodies, and have now infected their worship, which is not pure. And so later, of course, in the Mark Gospel, when his ministry begins, he'll be going around exorcising everything. The Mark Gospel, which is my favorite, it's the oldest of the 4, is a gospel of Christ as an exorcist. He's constantly exorcising people, driving demons out of them. And this is why, Steiner says. So he's had this vision with these pagans, and he comes back to his body. They have fled, and he realizes that this is what's happened, that these people are worshiping demons. So he continues on his peregrinations, his journeys wandering through Palestine, and finally he comes upon the order of the Essenes. And the Essenes were an order that had been there for a while. It is possible that they were disaffected Pharisees who, after the revolt of the Maccabees and all the chaos that went on in Jerusalem with Alexander Jannaeus, who was one of the rulers in Jerusalem, who was fond of crucifying Pharisees. He had them crucified and persecuted relentlessly. So some scholars think it is possible that the Essenes are these exiled Pharisees who went out into the deserts in a monastic community where they renounced all their possessions, they renounced money, they wore white robes, and they practiced the cult of baptism. And they were aniconic. They had an anathema on entering into the gates of any temples that had images on them. They would refuse to enter a city where the gates had representations of images, so they were very aniconic. So the Jesus of Nazareth individual, this is about the age of 24 now, which would be his second Jupiter return, at the age of 24, encounters these people, and they think he's amazing and interesting. They sort of adopt him, but sort of not. They're wary of him. It's a little bit like in Dune with Paul Atreides, and he's taken in by the Fremen out in the desert, and they're not too sure about this guy. But the interesting thing about the Essenes is that they did have a prophecy where they expected not one Messiah, but 2 Messiahs. One Messiah sprung from the priestly line, and the other Messiah would be sprung from the kingly line. And here we have a boy who has come from a cousin who was sprung from the kingly line, the Solomonic line, and he himself is from the priestly line. Interesting connection. So he's communing with the Essenes and learning from them, and at some point he has a vision. There's another vision, another out-of-body experience where he leaves his body and he communes with the Buddha, whose astral body he has inherited. So he communes with the Buddha, and the Buddha tells him that there were certain limitations on his teachings, but that the Essenes are a monastic order, and their ideas need to be democratized. They're too incestuous, let's say. They're too endogamous with their ideas. So he has this vision of the Buddha. And then after a while, he encounters John the Baptist. And John the Baptist, it is thought by some scholars that John the Baptist may have been an Essene, since he was a Baptist, and the Essenes practiced baptism, and he lived out in the desert as they did. So he may very well have been an Essene. And in conversation with John the Baptist, the two hit it off like a sort of mentor and a pupil. The two hit it off. Jesus is in his later 20s, like 27-ish now. And as he's talking to him, he sort of sees the ghost of Elijah in John the Baptist. And he realizes that John the Baptist represents the continuity of this tradition. And indeed, it is a traditional idea, believe it or not, that it is thought that John the Baptist was the reincarnation of Elijah. The two are described wearing similar garments, camel's hair garments, and practice doing similar miracles. Elijah performs all these miracles. The voice of the Bath Kol was very strong, speaking through Elijah in those days, and also the line of prophets that Jesus is trying to plug himself into and resurrect, because he sees all this decadence. So in other words, Jesus is living in an age where in Palestine the whole thing has entropically come to a state of thermodynamic equilibrium, where all the potential energy is gone in all these religions and cults. The cults are infected by demons. People are infected by demons. The prophets can no longer hear the voice of the Bath Kol. The place is in serious trouble, not to mention all the political troubles in Jerusalem and so forth that just kept going on and on and on until the temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 A.D., when the first three Gospels were written, the Synoptic Gospels, and the John Gospel dates later from like 90 A.D. So he has this vision that John the Baptist is the reincarnation of Elijah. This is my teacher. This is the man who is going to teach me and initiate me into the mysteries. And so that's it for this chapter, chapter 4. And we can see here how Steiner is being wonderfully weird and entirely creative about the missing years of Jesus, about which we know next to nothing before John the Baptist baptizes him. So we're almost up to that point. And at that point, the Christ being will descend down into him. So we can see that he's becoming, Steiner's point here is that the Jesus boy was a very highly spiritually evolved individual who had inherited the astral body of the Buddha, the ego of Zarathustra, and will have the Christ being come down within him, which will displace the Zarathustra ego at that point of the baptism in the Jordan when he's 30 by his master, his mentor, the Essene, by that point probably ex-Essene, John the Baptist. So this would make a wonderful work of fiction for for anyone for any of you budding writers who want to write a version of the life of Christ. You're not going to find this in any of the Gospels or anywhere else. It truly is a fifth gospel. I think it's quite fun to talk about and think about.